Right now. Okay, so here goes my screensaver. Good start. What the hell? Dude, what? Alright, let's see if this will work here. Hold on. Yep, wonderful. Let's see. This is why we start early. Okay. Alright, so hi everybody, I'm Mark Mager, and today I'll be talking about script obfuscation, and we'll be providing you with a general set of guidelines and techniques for defeating it. Also like to give a shout out to everybody who actually still stuck around for this talk. You know? Love that you guys are drinking. Yeah, it's great. I had a drink before this, so everybody's nice and loose. You know, Met the Man and Red Man are coming on later tonight, so, you know, I got to open up for them right here. So, yeah, I'm the hype man. All right, so just start off here. Here's a quick high-level outline of the major talking points I'll be discussing this evening. So, first off, I'll start off with a little bit about myself. I'm based out of the DC metro area and have been a malware researcher at Endgame for the past 6 months. I've spent around 10 years in the computer security industry and have spent time developing computer network operations tools in R&D shops, as well as provided malware analysis and reverse engineering capabilities to government customers in Tier 3 environments. Also, as is evident from the picture on the right, I've become quite adept at multitasking over the years. So, obfuscation. What exactly is obfuscation? Well, here's Wikipedia's long-winded description of obfuscation, which actually starts out as a bit of a circular definition. But, in short, obfuscation is deliberately obscuring the purpose and/or logic of source code through manual or automated means. Why are scripts obfuscated? Well, depending on the audience, obfuscation is deployed in commercial or legitimate software primarily to protect an organization's intellectual property and, in some extremely misguided cases, to help secure sensitive data such as embedded login credentials. I probably shouldn't have to get into that too much to say why that's a bad idea. As for malware authors, they have two primary interests. First of all, they want to help the script to avoid detection by obscuring the true nature of the code, and second of all, they want to deter any sort of reverse engineering efforts. By obscuring the APIs called at runtime and any data structures, objects, or plaintext strings that are used, these scripts will have a higher chance of avoiding any detection hardware or software employed by the targeted user or organization, and thus provide a higher chance of being successfully executed on the host. Okay, so how are scripts obfuscated? Well, manual obfuscation is feasible, but it's not feasible at scale. You know, one of the prime examples of manual obfuscation is the Obfuscated C contest that takes place annually. You can definitely look that up, and there's definitely plenty of examples of code that you just have absolutely no idea what's going on. But yeah, like I said, it's not practical or feasible at a large scale. So automated obfuscators are going to be leveraged primarily to provide a simple means for producing these obfuscated scripts. There are several known obfuscators freely available for download at the price of a small license fee. If you just Google automated obfuscator plus any language, you'll find, you know, as many results as you need, and along with white papers, you know, academic papers for other proposed obfuscators that are out there. And, you know, in certain cases, malware authors may even develop or customize their own obfuscators to suit their own needs for their missions. Let's see. So, in modern-day attack scenarios, scripts are usually not the ultimate payload that malware authors intend to execute. I know that's a wide-sweeping statement, so of course there are exceptions to the rule. A very recent example is the PowerShell ransomware known as Powerware. That's, I feel like, come back like it came up a few months ago, so that's definitely something that's prevalent. But in general, scripts are used in one of two ways. Either they're used to gain an initial foothold on a system and retrieve and invoke an executable payload, which is something that is going to actually carry the mission out. Or in the scenario with exploit kits and drive-by downloads, when JavaScript's employed, it tends to be used more for OS and host environment detection, and ultimately to help redirect the user to exploit code that's targeted towards exploiting their environment. All right, so deobfuscation. Why should we go through the trouble of deobfuscating scripts? Can't we just fire up a VM, open up Procmon and Wireshark, and launch our scripts, and we're good to go? Well, you certainly can, but as is the case generally with all dynamic malware analysis, you'll be missing out on a lot of details. The only way to truly know the full extent of an obfuscated script's capabilities is through deobfuscation and static analysis. Extracting indicators of compromise and determining possible sources or attribution is definitely much easier if a script has been deobfuscated. Okay, so deobfuscation goals. Our primary goal when it comes to deobfuscating scripts is obtaining a real understanding of the code. We want the code to be first and foremost readable by humans. We want to easily be able to obtain context about the purpose of the code and how it's being used. And we also want to decipher the control and data flow so we can manually trace through the code and fit the puzzle pieces all together. And yeah, one other thing is the code simplification. That's definitely one of the main goals, I would say, is that wherever there are opportunities for us to simplify something, like, we can definitely take it, because ultimately we're just trying to produce something that's logically equivalent to the initial obfuscated script, but something that's a lot more easy to understand by human. Okay, so what do you need? Now that you've actually determined that you need to deobfuscate scripts, what tools do you need? Well, first off, a virtual machine is an absolute requirement because you'll be handling what are thought to be malicious scripts that possess unknown capabilities. And even the most careful engineer or analyst is liable to accidentally execute a script in their environment, which could have, unforeseen consequences, to say the least. So an isolated and safe environment is a necessity. Second of all, you'll need a fully featured source code editor with language syntax highlighting, function and variable highlighting, and robust find and replace features. So, definitely not very strict requirements there. Notepad++ definitely fits the bill for everything. So yeah, freely downloadable. The third thing you'll need, of course, is the internet. Scripting, language documentation, and examples are invaluable resources, as obfuscated scripts tend to use language features that are definitely either uncommon or potentially confusing as part of their deterrent to reverse engineering. Online testing frameworks are definitely very handy for evaluating smaller chunks of code that may be more difficult to carry out manually. And of course, more advanced cases will also require a debugger, as we'll discuss in more detail later on. So, some general tips before we get started. There's no specific order of steps you need to carry out in order to properly deobfuscate a script. It's a very nonlinear process that relies on intuition and pattern detection. So you don't have to force yourself to go from top to bottom or the beginning of the control flow to the end of the control flow. Starting out, you'll want to deobfuscate code sections that your eyes gravitate towards and that are not overly convoluted. You're picking off the low-hanging fruit, essentially. The more sections you're initially able to break down, the easier the overall deobfuscation process will be on you. Code uniformity is definitely very crucial to the deobfuscation process. If you're deobfuscating and writing out your version of the code, you'll want to take ownership of the code and employ consistent coding conventions and indentation. You'll also want to standardize and simplify how function calls are written where possible and how variables are declared and defined. Understanding how any native scripting language functions are used will also help to further break down the script, as you can replace these functions with the results where possible. All right, let's get started. Let's see. So for unused and garbage code, first off, you'll want to eliminate any of that where it's apparent. Garbage code is definitely very easily determined by using both variable and function highlighting as well as defined functions provided by your text editor of choice. Any variables or functions that are not subsequently referenced elsewhere within the code can be commented out or removed quite easily. So in this sample piece of code, we have about 30 lines of, some of it looks like junk, but we can't really tell. In the sample code, I've highlighted one variable and discovered that it's not referenced elsewhere within this routine. Now, if we assume that this is not a global variable and it's not referenced elsewhere within the code, then we can quickly remove it. There are several other variables within this function that also follow that same pattern of an integer plus the string value of an integer, and they also all happen to not be referenced anywhere else within the code. So if we go ahead and remove these unnecessary variables, we're left with a much cleaner and easier to look at subroutine. Probably the most commonly seen obfuscation technique, and one that's definitely the most prevalent, I would say, is the use of complicated variable and function names. Strings containing a combination of upper and lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols are pretty difficult to look at and are difficult to tell apart at first glance. So the idea is here is that we want to replace them with more descriptive, easier to digest names that our brains can actually go over much quicker. While you can use the find and replace function provided by your editor, in this case you'll need to be careful in order to avoid any sort of issues that might come up with global versus local scope. Later on, once you actually have a better understanding of the purpose of a function or a variable, you can go back and update their names to something a little more informative like HTTP GET request or decoding routine. Going back to the code we just removed all the unnecessary variables from, we can see we're left with several complicated strings representing or labeling variables and functions. So if we go ahead with relabeling, the data flow becomes a little more clear. var1 will contain the result of a create object call, and var1 is then subsequently used to carry out a write function call with the data passed into the subroutine. Obscured control flow is usually not evident until much later in the deobfuscation process, but what you're generally looking for is ways to simplify function calls so that they're more direct. For instance, if you have one function that is called by 3 different functions, but each of those functions transform the input in the exact same way and call the underlying function identically, then those 3 functions could be merged into one simple function. Function order can also come into play as well. If you think a more logical ordering of the functions that matches up with the control flow that you've observed will help you better understand the code, then by all means rearrange the function order. So in this example, we have 5 subroutines. After these subroutines are defined, there's an initial call to sub 5 at the bottom, line 21. If you trace through the subroutines, you'll see that each one is called along the way, but the ultimate subroutine that is executed is sub 2. So any calls outside of this code section to any of these 5 subs will result in ultimately in a call to sub 2, which actually carries out an operation other than calling another subroutine. Thus, we can merge all these subroutines into one simple subroutine, sub 2. And so any other references to sub 1, 3, 4, 5 could just be replaced with a reference to this, to our new, old sub. Arithmetic sequences. When it comes to hard-coded numeric values, obfuscators may employ very simple arithmetic to thwart reverse engineers. Other than doing the actual math, it's definitely important to research the exact behavior of the scripting language implementation of the mathematical functions that are used. In this example, a sequence of numbers that are added and subtracted are passed into the ASCII character functions, which expects an integer value in the ASCII range. if you do the actual math, you'll find the 86s in the sequence cancel each other out and result in 0, while the 9.5s add up to 38. When 38 is passed into the character function, that results in an ampersand. In this sample, the first line in the obfuscated code initializes an array of 3 double values. The second line simply sets a variable to the second element of the array, which is 5,432. The third line uses the sign function, which returns a 1 or a -1 based on whether or not the value supplied is positive or negative, and the absolute value function is also used at the end for a bit of misdirection. The code can ultimately be simplified to 1 or even 2 lines in the end, and we'll know the exact double value that the last variable will be set to eventually. As for obfuscated string values, you'll want to simplify the use of any ASCII character functions to start with, then eliminate any obvious null strings, and then standardize strings, how strings are concatenated, and merge together any substrings where possible. This line of code primarily relies on the stir reverse VBA function, which, you guessed it, reverses a string. The null strings contained within the function can be eliminated right off the bat, and once the string is reversed and appended to the initial C string, we're left with the below result that invokes a command shell to run the command represented by the variable, and then ultimately terminate itself. Now here's a more common scenario seen in VBA macros. The macro in this case is building a Windows batch file, which will later be executed. If we carry out the string concatenation, eliminate all the null strings, and resolve ASCII characters, we're left with a much clearer picture of the purpose of the batch file. As we can see, the batch file will ultimately invoke a VB script file located in a subdirectory of the current user's temp directory. Okay, so you tried everything and your script is still obfuscated. You have no idea what else to do. Well, in this case you'll want to utilize a debugger and start doing some more dynamic analysis. Our goal in this case is to circumvent the obfuscation and seek out any sort of silver bullets in the form of eval functions or string decoding routines. Going back to the resolve what you can first approach, you might also want to start out by commenting out code sections in order to help restrict the program execution. Sidestepping C2 and download functions may also be necessary, so those might need to be commented out as well. And definitely leverage the debugger where you can. So take, for instance, in this example of an obfuscated script. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but if you follow the function that's highlighted in green, you can see that's referred to several times. Takes as input 1 hexadecimal string and 1 alphanumeric string with varying letter cases, and returns a value. Based off the context in which the function is called, as part of a native scripting language function call in most cases, the return value is presumed to be a string. Thus, we can hypothesize that this function is a simple string decoding routine, and since we are using a debugger, we don't need to manually perform the decoding or reverse engineer all of its inner workings. We can simply set breakpoints before the function is called and prior to the function being returned in order to resolve what the decoded strings are. Alright, so you have to bear with me for this deobfuscation walkthrough. I had to completely redo this because everybody's been having problems with video today. So I went back and did screenshots of doing deobfuscation in my hotel room, like literally an hour ago. Okay. So let's say you get something like this dropped off at your desk, or some macro just comes through your Gmail embedded in a Word document. You extract it and you get something like this. What the hell do? You got 76 lines of what appears to be garbage. Some functions kind of stick out, some don't. Where do you even start? So you can start with removing junk, right? So one of the easiest things to do is go through and remove any sort of variables that aren't being referenced, any sort of functions that aren't being referenced. These are the easiest variables that stick out that aren't being referenced. I'm definitely leveraging the variable and function syntax highlighting within Notepad++. So if I go through and eliminate those, I cut through about 15 lines of code already. So things already look a lot better, but definitely a lot more work to go. If we start to do standardize the formatting that's involved here, things will become a little clearer after that. This is more just getting the indentation correct, getting the standard coding conventions to kind of line up, and just making things a little more hunky-dory. So that's initially what the first 40 lines of code look like if we just get proper tabs in line. And rearranging function order. That's something that appears to be definitely, like, I'd say, rise to the top right away, because once you look through the different functions involved, the 4 subroutines at the top, I was able to rearrange them because they're kind of split up in different sections within the code in order to make it a little clearer by jamming them all together. And then I can kind of see that ultimately the result of any of these calls, which are automatically invoked when Word or whatever Office application this macro is embedded within, will result in auto-open, auto_open, workbook open, one of those. But ultimately, they're calling that the subroutine on line 17, right? So I can take that and I can go through and merge all the functions together, right? So all I need now is just there's an initial auto-open, and then that calls what appears to be the main function. So now I can go through and start to relabel some functions here and there. I relabeled the function that's called by auto-open to main. I went through and relabeled the one function func1, and I relabeled the subroutine right after that as sub1. So nothing mind-blowing, but just very simple things where the dividends will pay off later on, because, like, as you can see on lines 22 and 23, they're invoking func1, whereas it might not have been very apparent before, just because of the mix of complicated variable and function names that are being used. Okay, so now we can actually begin simplifying, right? What we'll want to focus on is in particular the main subroutine. And if we kind of already look, like I've done some very simple string concatenation in certain cases, like on line 9, I combine TE and MP to produce temp. I mean, that's very apparent. If I actually go through and on line 7 collapse and merge together all these statements, ultimately I get -1. That's all that is attempting to produce. So that's just doing the math. And so the picture begins to clear up, right? So I added the -1 on line 9 to the ASCII character function, to that value being passed in. So that's character 101 that's being evaluated there. I can start to see what kind of look like file paths start to take shape, but it's still not quite clear. If I go a little further, I can start to see that we have an exe and an RTF extension, and the variable on line 8 appears to be a path to the user's temp directory. Now, if I go a little further with that, yes, they're definitely file paths. Right, so we have 2 RTF documents, and we have an executable that's being referenced to, and they're all going to be located within the user's temp directory. So we collapse things a little bit more. We relabel variables where we can, and the references later on in the code, and this is what we're left with. It's definitely a lot clearer as to the intent, at least of the initial preamble within the subroutine. But we can even go further, right? So we see this create object call on line 14, right? And we're passing Word.application, right? If we go through and relabel any sort of instance with that to Word app object, it becomes clear that we're dealing with a reference to a newly spawned Word application that we're actually setting to false. And then we're opening the first RTF document that's referenced on line 7. Now, later on, that's going to be terminated. Then we, dereference that object. And now we can proceed with renaming some other variables, and these are ones that are further down the line, right? this is more just going through and just kind of doing some bookkeeping, getting some of those more obfuscated strings. And now we can do some also function relabeling based off the context of what these other functions do, right? So we can quite clearly see on line 25 that that's just calling the save as function. So we can look back and see how that's being used. The subroutine on line 28, that's all that's doing is just invoking the VBA timer for just kind of essentially initiating a sleep, and the function on line 36, that's just for launching a command shell and passing command to it. So we're done. That actually seemed pretty straightforward, right? Here's what the actual end result is. So definitely a little more clear, but if we want to go down and kind of go through and order the control flow, we're saving a copy of the active document of the current Word document that's being referenced. We're saving two copies of that. One called 322.rtf, one called 311.rtf. We're saving them to the temp directory. We're creating a new instance of Microsoft Word that's going to be not visible, and it's going to launch the first RTF, I think, as I mentioned. And we're going to spawn a command shell in order to launch the pm3.exe executable that's also located in the temp directory. And that's pretty much it. So, luckily for us, there are several tools to further assist us with deobfuscating scripts. There are tools such as AMSI and JSONPACK that attempt to automatically produce deobfuscated versions of scripts with varying results. There are plenty of debuggers out there that get the job done for most languages as well, thank God. And there are also several online testing frameworks which are very handy, can greatly speed up the deobfuscation process, so you don't even need a debugger in those instances. All right, so to wrap things up, in conclusion, script deobfuscation is very achievable. Your end result should be something that's very simple and human readable. That is first and foremost logically equivalent to the original obfuscated script. As part of the process, you need to rely on your intuition to guide you and resolve smaller sections of code in order to derive context to how they're used. Also, removing the extra code is very helpful along the way, and always be sure to consult the official scripting language documentation when needed. All right. Thanks for listening. All right. Any questions? Yeah. I mean, oh, yeah, he basically was referencing any sort of automated obfuscators and which ones I'd recommend. Actually, that's a pretty good question because, for the most part, I just did research on those and to see what's out there, but, I haven't really personally played around with them. JSONPACK, I feel like I've used a few years ago and just never had any real success. And most of the other research that I did into automatic deobfuscation is just very tailored to specific obfuscators, and it's just, it's hard to find a silver bullet, I think, to ultimately, do deobfuscation. AMSI, from what I've heard, is promising in how they can do, essentially runtime deobfuscation of PowerShell scripts, but haven't played around with it enough to be able to say one way or another it's good. No, I have not come across those, but I mean, it definitely seems like what's, something that hasn't been used in years is something that's, definitely going to be, ripe for, more common reuse. I think it's just, you know, the more obscure the functions or plugins or whatever, you know, that's fair game. So, but yeah, haven't specifically heard about that yet. All right. Anybody else? All right. Thanks, guys.